It didn't come with a warning. It didn't arrive with polite negotiation or whispered promises. In just 22 minutes, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the 36-year-old transitional president of Burkina Faso, pulled the plug on Europe's control and switched on a sovereign telecom network for 22 million people. No IMF loans, no Silicon Valley backdoor deals, no imported blueprints. Just satellites built in Koudougou, fiber cables laid by Burkinabé hands, and a firewall coded in Mahun. For nearly 3 decades, Burkina Faso's digital lifeline was owned by foreign telecom giants. Our calls routed through Paris, our data stored on European servers, our internet cut off during protests by companies headquartered thousands of miles away. And for decades, we were told this was normal. But on a dry August morning in Ouagadougou, that normal cracked wide open. In front of reporters, engineers, and security officers standing under the Sahel sun, Traoré didn't just give a speech. He rewrote the rules. He announced Faso Telecom, a functioning, fully independent national telecom empire with 92% coverage from the outskirts of Pama to the rocky edges of Gorom Gorom. Funded entirely from redirected national wealth, gold royalties once lost to foreign corporations, military budgets once spent on hosting foreign troops, Faso Telecom was built without a single Western supervisor. 647 Burkinabé engineers, most under 35 trained at home, designed it for our own climate, our own terrain, our own needs. And the message was clear. Our voice will no longer leave this continent before it reaches our neighbor. If a landlocked, sanctioned nation scarred by decades of dependency can do this in 14 months without asking permission from anyone, what else might Africa build? And who exactly gets to set the standards for connection in the 21st century? If you believe this story matters, share it. If you're one of the first to stand behind leaders who choose sovereignty over subservience, subscribe. And if you know someone who still thinks Africa needs permission to rise, send them this signal. Because today that signal is ours. The morning air in Ouagadougou was dry and sharp, carrying with it the faint hum of anticipation. A stage had been set under the open Sahel sky, no red carpet, no foreign dignitaries, no corporate banners. Only the national flag, the hum of equipment, and rows of chairs filled with reporters, local engineers in blue overalls, and security officers standing watch. At exactly 9:00 a.m., Captain Ibrahim Traoré stepped forward. He didn't warm the crowd with pleasantries. He didn't list promises for the future. Instead, he looked out and began delivering numbers like hammer strikes. 200 kilometers of fiber optic cable now lay beneath Burkina Faso's soil, stretching from the rolling hills near Bobo Dioulasso to the desert edges of Dori. 65 ground-based satellite stations had been erected, not in French factories, not in Chinese assembly lines, but inside the country's own borders, in workshops staffed by Burkinabé welders, technicians, and coders. 211 relay towers, each built from locally produced steel, now stood as sentinels across plains, mountains, and savanna. The result, 92% national coverage, reaching deep into villages where internet access had been little more than a rumor. Then came the figure that silenced the last whispers in the crowd, $1.2 billion USD. That was the total cost of Faso Telecom, and not a cent had come from the IMF, the World Bank, or any European credit line. Instead, Burkina Faso had re-engineered its own economy to pay for it. Military expenditures once used to host foreign troops were redirected toward infrastructure. Royalties from gold mines once siphoned off by foreign conglomerates with little return were seized, renegotiated, and funneled directly into the project. The Telecommunications Sovereignty Fund, created in late 2023, rerouted the domestic levies that used to be paid to foreign carriers. Those funds no longer left the country. They dug into it. And perhaps the most remarkable part, this network had been conceived, designed, and built entirely by Burkinabé engineers. 647 scientists and technicians, 83% under the age of 35, had been trained in Ouagadougou and based in Koudougou. A year ago, their names had barely been known outside their neighborhoods. Today, they stood behind a digital revolution. The plan wasn't copied from Western blueprints. Every cable route had been mapped using data collected by Burkina Faso's own satellites. The towers and stations were designed to withstand Saharan heat flash floods and dust storms. The signal relays were optimized for the unpredictable electricity patterns in rural areas. As one project lead explained, "We built it for the land we live on, not for a showroom." Traoré's tone never rose, but the message was unmistakable. The country's 27-year dependence on foreign telecom contracts had ended. For decades, a French conglomerate had owned the backbone of the nation's communications, routing calls through Europe, storing data in Paris, and charging licensing fees in foreign currencies. When protests broke out in 2021, entire provinces were cut off by companies headquartered in Marseille. Now the control was homegrown. No European advisors, no Chinese supervisors, no imported hardware dependency. Even the software powering the network's core was coded domestically in modular languages by graduates of the Faso Tech Institute, a school that had opened just 16 months earlier. And perhaps that was the quietest but most powerful victory of all. The same young people whose voices had once been silenced during internet blackouts were now the ones designing the switches that carried voices across the country. By the time Traoré paused, the list of achievements was more than statistics. It was a blueprint for sovereignty unveiled in the heart of a landlocked nation that had just proven the world wrong. The turning point came not with the numbers, but with a sentence short, measured, and heavy enough to ripple across continents. Our voice will no longer leave this continent before it reaches our neighbor. There was no applause, only the sound of camera shutters. Within minutes, the meaning sank in. Burkina Faso had severed the invisible wires that had tied its communication lifeline to foreign hands for nearly 3 decades. Then, in a moment that many in the audience did not expect, Traoré signed an executive decree on live television. The document terminated every existing foreign telecom contract in the country, effective immediately. No phased withdrawal, no grace period. The biggest blow fell on Tele SA, a French telecom giant that had operated in Burkina Faso for 27 years. By nightfall, their operating license was revoked, their assets frozen, and their control over the nation's data severed. The financial tremor was immediate. On the Paris Stock Exchange, Tele SA's shares plunged within hours. Meanwhile, Helionet Group, a Luxembourg-based conglomerate that owned major underground fiber routes, filed an international arbitration case demanding $276 million in damages. Their legal claim accused Burkina Faso of economic destabilization and violation of bilateral agreements signed in 1998. Burkina Faso's Ministry of Justice replied with a single page, "We do not negotiate the return of what was always ours." It was a statement that cut deeper than any technical specification. This wasn't just about telecom infrastructure. It was about reclaiming dignity, and it put the entire Sahel and beyond on notice. The reactions were swift and divided. From Brussels, the EU Commission issued a formal note of concern about the dangers of centralized state control over communications. From Washington, the U.S. Commerce Department quietly requested clarification on spectrum governance. From London, media headlines warned of a digital iron curtain rising in West Africa. But in Nairobi, an editorial board hailed it as the first diplomatic firewall in African history. In Cotonou, political analysts debated whether this could spark a wave of digital sovereignty movements across the continent. In Dakar, student groups celebrated with banners reading, "If they can do it, why not?" Yes, international newsrooms scrambled to frame the moment. The Guardian headlined, "Burkina Faso breaks away." CNN Africa called it Africa's quiet telecom revolution. The Economist went further, asking, "Can Burkina Faso be trusted with its own data?" Yet beneath the commentary lay a quieter, more unsettling truth for foreign powers. If Burkina Faso could connect 92% of its population without Western loans or corporate oversight, what else might it achieve without outside permission? And if it didn't need Europe to lay cables, why would it need Europe to write constitutions or draft trade policies? Inside Burkina Faso, the mood was electric. In Ouagadougou, cafe conversations buzzed about what this meant for daily life. In rural towns, local radio hosts explained the significance in Fulfulde and more, reminding listeners that this signal is ours now. The engineers who had worked quietly for months were suddenly national heroes, their faces appearing on social media posts with captions like, "Built by our own hands." Even the opposition, normally quick to attack government projects, found little room to criticize. One veteran politician admitted off-camera, "We've talked about sovereignty for decades. They actually did it." In the days that followed, Western embassies in the Sahel began quietly expanding their cybersecurity attaché offices. Analysts speculated this was not out of fear of sabotage but fear of exclusion. If Burkina Faso's data was now locked behind encryption algorithms written in local languages and hosted on domestic servers, foreign surveillance capabilities would be limited like never before. That was the real rupture. And it came not with a bang, but with the quiet hum of servers deep beneath the red sands of Koudougou servers that no longer answered to Paris, Brussels, or Washington. When the initial shockwaves settled, the real measure of Faso Telecom's impact began to take shape not in the headlines, but in the homes, schools, and fields of Burkina Faso. For ordinary citizens, the difference was immediate and tangible. In the rural highlands of the Sahel, schoolchildren who had once relied on sporadic, costly internet cafes could now log into Faso Learn, the national education platform, from solar-powered devices. Lessons were recorded in Moor and Fulfulde, taught by volunteer teachers from the University of Ouagadougou, and backed up on national servers in Manga. For the first time, entire curricula were accessible without a single byte leaving the country. In border towns like Djibo, mothers could initiate live video consultations through Faso Health Grid, a peer-to-peer encrypted system built for low-power areas. There were no intermediaries, no foreign data centers, no third-party reviews. The patient's voice reached only the doctor she chose. The encryption keys never crossed national borders. For farmers, the change was just as transformative. Through Faso Farmer, over 130,000 smallholders began receiving real-time weather forecasts, pest alerts, and crop market prices. What once took days via radio relay now arrived in seconds. Planting and harvesting decisions that had been guesswork for generations were now informed by domestic satellite data. But beyond the practical services, Faso Telecom represented something deeper, a shift in psychology. The very people whose voices had been silenced during the 72-hour blackout of 2021 were now the ones coding the switches, managing the servers, and deciding the rules of connection. Sovereignty was no longer an abstract slogan. It was an everyday utility. Politically, the launch redefined the government's leverage. No foreign telecom company could now threaten service cuts as a bargaining chip. No overseas boardroom could dictate licensing fees or set the pace of digital expansion. When information is routed through domestic infrastructure, the power to disconnect or disrupt lies solely within the country's borders. This did not come without controversy. Opposition figures and some civil society groups voiced concern that the same central control protecting national sovereignty could, in the wrong hands, be used to stifle dissent. International watchdogs echoed these fears, warning of unchecked state authority over digital infrastructure. Traoré's administration responded with a public commitment. The system's core code would remain open-source, accessible for audit by accredited institutions within the country. All bandwidth dedicated to education, healthcare, and agriculture would remain free of charge and unrestricted, a safeguard to ensure that sovereignty did not become a tool for exclusion. On the international stage, the political ripple effects spread quickly. In Malawi and Sierra Leone, lawmakers began drafting bills inspired by Burkina Faso's data sovereignty protocols. Ghana's opposition MPs openly asked, if they can build it, why can't we? The African Union's ICT working group quietly requested a closed-door presentation of Faso Telecom's architecture. Meanwhile, foreign investors began reassessing their positions. Without access to Burkina Faso's telecom backbone, the appeal of certain cross-border infrastructure deals diminished. Western embassies, still processing the loss of a decades-old leverage point, recalibrated their strategies, shifting from control to cautious courtship. For Burkina Faso, the political payoff was immediate: a stronger bargaining position in regional negotiations, new channels for South-South partnerships, and a symbolic victory that resonated far beyond its borders. In the streets of Ouagadougou, it wasn't unusual to see billboards with the Faso Telecom logo and the national motto, "What we build, we defend." The slogan was more than marketing. It was a promise, and perhaps a warning. Because for the first time in a generation, the wires, towers, and satellites connecting Burkina Faso belonged to its own people. And in a continent where the flow of information has too often been controlled from elsewhere, that ownership was a political earthquake. From Washington to Brussels, Faso Telecom's debut wasn't treated as just another African infrastructure project. In diplomatic corridors, it was read as a strategic signal, a sign that one of the smallest economies in the world had just cut a vital thread in the West's network of influence. In the United States, the reaction was layered. Officially, the U.S. Commerce Department framed its inquiry as a request for technical clarification on spectrum governance. Off-the-record, cybersecurity analysts in D.C. admitted the concern was far more political. A sovereign telecom network means fewer backdoors for intelligence gathering and reduced leverage in bilateral negotiations. Washington's Africa desks have long viewed telecom infrastructure as a soft power anchor, a way to influence policy through control of the digital grid. Faso Telecom snapped that anchor. American media reflected the divide. Outlets like The Atlantic and Foreign Policy acknowledged the achievement but warned of the risk of state-controlled narratives. Meanwhile, African diaspora voices in the U.S., especially among African-American tech professionals, celebrated it as a proof of concept for Black-led digital sovereignty. For many, this wasn't about fear, it was about possibility. In Europe, the sting was sharper. France, having lost Télé-SA's lucrative 27-year grip on Burkina Faso's network, viewed the move as a precedent that could cascade across former colonies. Brussels policymakers privately worried that if Faso Telecom's model spread, the EU would lose both economic footholds and critical data streams in West Africa. Across the Global South, the reaction was far more enthusiastic. In Latin America, telecom engineers in Bolivia and Ecuador analyzed Faso Telecom's architecture for potential adaptation. In South Asia, Bangladeshi newspapers drew parallels to their own struggles for technological independence. The African Union's ICT committee quietly placed Faso Telecom on the agenda for its next summit, aware that this model and its political implications could define Africa's digital future. Security strategists worldwide recognized the doctrinal shift. Burkina Faso had demonstrated that a sovereign network could be built without Western capital, without Chinese supervision, and without foreign patent dependency. For nations wary of great power entanglements, this was a roadmap. In think tanks from London to New York, panels debated a central question. If a landlocked African nation with a GDP under $18 billion can achieve this in 14 months, what happens when larger economies follow suit? Some warned of a fragmented internet where regional networks bypass global standards. Others saw an overdue correction to decades of centralized control in Silicon Valley and European capitals. For the United States in particular, Faso Telecom's rise poses a diplomatic challenge. In a world where data is as strategic as oil, losing access to an entire nation's digital lifeblood isn't just a commercial inconvenience, it's a geopolitical shift. If the Traoré Doctrine of infrastructure sovereignty spreads, Washington may find itself engaging with African states on far more equal terms without the quiet leverage of the past. And for nations long on the receiving end of digital development aid, Faso Telecom has flipped the script. Burkina Faso isn't asking for assistance, it's offering a blueprint. Faso Telecom's launch is more than a technological milestone, it's a line in the sand. It tells the world that Burkina Faso will no longer rent its future from foreign landlords. The wires are no longer neutral. The signal no longer passes through distant boardrooms before reaching a neighbor's home. But sovereignty comes with its own tests. The same infrastructure that empowers can also be abused if vigilance fades. If future leaders lose sight of the principles behind Faso Telecom, open access free public services in education, health, and agriculture, and the absence of foreign control, the network could risk becoming what it was built to resist. In that sense, the real work begins now, and the world is watching. In African capitals, lawmakers and engineers are studying the Faso model, wondering if they can replicate it. In Western think tanks, strategists are recalculating how to engage with nations that no longer rely on external telecom grids. The question isn't whether Faso Telecom will inspire imitation, it's how far and how fast the idea will travel. For Burkina Faso, the stakes go beyond bandwidth. This is about rewriting the definition of basic needs. In the 20th century, that meant water, food, and shelter. In the 21st, it must also mean secure sovereign connectivity, the ability to speak, learn, and trade without foreign permission. If this principle takes root across Africa, the continent's geopolitical position could shift in ways that no trade deal or military alliance has ever managed. But there's also a warning for those watching from afar. When nations begin to control their own digital lifelines, they also control the narratives that shape their identities. For decades, Africa's stories were told through channels owned elsewhere. Now, with sovereign networks, those stories can be told in African languages framed by African priorities and delivered without the filter of foreign interests. For some powers, that's liberating. For others, it's unsettling. So here's the question for you wherever you are watching, from Nairobi, Memphis, Bamako, or Baltimore. Do you believe this is the future Africa deserves? Or do you think the old system with all its dependencies still serves us better? If you feel pride, knowing that young Burkinabé engineers wrote the code, laid the cables, and flipped the switch themselves, share this story. If you believe that sovereignty in the digital age is as vital as sovereignty over land or resources, subscribe and help keep this conversation alive. And if you know someone who still thinks Africa must ask for permission to rise, send them this signal. Because today, for the first time in generations, the signal belongs entirely to us. And once you've owned your connection, you never go back.